No, Mike,
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think
With
this is the
intention.
conversation that we really need to have. Why is TEA here? Because we elected nut jobs and they were all fighting over each other. And whenever adults fight,
Not you, Judith.
not you. This is back in.
Not the case. So currently in Harris County, 22% of students earn some sort of credential within 6 years of their high school graduation. 22%.
Only.
And yet,
Let's make sure we say only.
Yes, that's like
How
very,
would you feel about maybe 4 of the 9 being at large?
What are your thoughts about school closure, consolidation?
we have the same amount of students that we had in 1988, and we have 50 more buildings. That, and we have a lot more employees than we did when we did prior to that too. And so what's talked about, we're not talking about how many students can read. We're not talking about how many Black boys can read. And we should be talking about that. We should be storming.
Hey guys, welcome again to another edition of TEA Leaves Houston. I've actually got my tea today, folks. Look at that. Check that out. Hot tea on a super hot day in Houston. This podcast is about preparing Houston for the day when TEA leaves. Whether you like TEA or not, they are going to leave. And we as a community need to be prepared. And we're not at all prepared. And so this show is meant to try to get us prepared. We've got the usual suspects here. We've got Uyosa Eligan, 25-year-old change agent who's been focusing on the youth voice and empowering youth for, 10 years, and he's only 25. So he's been at this for a while. Tori Cofield, we won't talk about how long Tori has been in this game, but she's taught, she's started school, she's been a superintendent, she's done kind of everything you can think of in the educational space. Her focus is really around urban schools and trying to get better outcomes for urban kids. And so, Tori, always great to see you. And then finally, last and least, Mike Fallick, former school board.
Only you can get away with that.
Former trustee at Spring Branch ISD, and he has really been focused on outcomes. What outcome are we actually trying to get after? And so today we have Judith Cruz joining us, one of the sitting trustees, the elected trustee, who's been sidelined as a result of TEA. Now, we had Sue Dygard on last week's show, and I think we took it easy on her, and we're not going to do that today. I've already told Judith we're going to come right at her, and I'm going to start with the first question. Judith, first off, thanks for being on the show. Always appreciate your comments and your thoughtfulness. Now, let me go ahead and stick you to the wall here. I have been watching the outcomes for Black boys and the reading outcomes for Black boys, in particular for third grade reading. And that number has stayed horrifyingly low for decades. I am pissed that under your leadership on HISD, that number hasn't changed. Why?
You should be pissed. And I say that in all seriousness. I think when you look at the news cycles and everything that comes out of, especially like just talking about the takeover, but just even in general, when we talk about HISD, what's talked about, we're not talking about how many students can read. We're not talking about how many Black boys can read. And we should be talking about that. We should be storming Hattie Mae White with anger, with demanding better for our students, especially when it comes to literacy. Third grade reading is such a critical indicator of long-term success. And I know a lot of people don't like to hear that, and it's all about test scores. We have to know how our kids are doing. And we know that not enough of them are reading, period. And with the pandemic, the achievement gap just got wider, so much wider that, 2 decades of progress was essentially erased. So we have a lot of work to do. I take full responsibility being on a board that did not achieve better outcomes for students, unfortunately. And you asked why.
Yeah, why?
It's really interesting. Governing a school board is very different from really any other undertaking that I've ever done. And I think it's pretty unique in terms of what elected officials typically do. It's very much focused on holding one person accountable to the outcomes of students. Right. We also have one other employee, which is the chief audit executive. But really, it's making sure that the superintendent is laser focused on achieving what our purpose is as a school district for our students. And that's making sure that our students have all of the opportunities that they deserve and that their potential can be reached. That is the purpose of our school district. And so if we're not doing that, it's really easy for school board members to get very distracted and involved in all kinds of decisions, contracts, hiring.
Yes.
These are all things that have to happen that make a school district run. And it's very easy to justify, well, I need to find out about this one thing, or I just need to make sure this thing is happening. The moment we start to do that, then we're telling the superintendent that's the priority and this is the priority. And even though we were very early adopters of Lone Star governance prior to me being on the school board, 2017.
Lone Star governance, that's the training about how a school board should operate, correct?
It's the training, and it's also a framework that is really, really focused, I would say hyper focused on the goals and constraints that a board adopts, student achievement, student outcome goals. What do students know? What do they know and able to do? And we're measuring that. And even though we were early adopters and we had the framework in place, we didn't always stay laser focused on it as a team of 10.
So Judith, I'm gonna ask you to just get right, like what's stopping that outcome from occurring? Like, let's just be real clear.
It's holding the person accountable, the person that makes the decisions for the district, right? We hold them accountable. And if we hold them accountable, we're saying this is good, not good enough, or this is good enough, right? And then finding the leader that is going to make those decisions. So it's about a lot of things, but it's about resource allocation, it's about prioritizing, it's about equity, it's about leadership, getting the right talent in front of students on a daily basis, making sure that teaching and learning is the highest quality. It can't just be the curriculum, it has to be the talent. Together with that, I mean, there's a confluence of things, but at the end of the day, it's having that right leader. And I don't think there's a lot of them that can walk into this job and do it really, really well in large urban districts. It takes very special
Very
skills.
difficult. Mike had a question.
So I sat for 9 years as an elected trustee in Spring Branch, 36,000 students at the time. Sat as board president twice. Was an officer on the board the entire time I was there, except for the first 2 years. I am probably of this group the person who can most directly respond to what you just said, and I'm going to. So about 6 years ago at a breakfast when HISD was hiring whichever superintendent along the way it hired, I asked the question of the then sitting trustees, who were none of whom are still on the board, when they were hiring the superintendent, what were they looking for? By way of telling that superintendent what they wanted as outcomes for students. You'll hear me say that a dozen times in this call. Outcomes are all I'm focused on, as everything else is just noise, in my opinion. And the answer that I got at that breakfast from both of the then sitting HISD trustees was, we're going to hire the superintendent and then we're going to let them tell us what the vision is. And I was horrified by that answer. The board sets policy. The board sets a vision. The board sets direction. The superintendent implements the direction. By the way, as an aside, the problem with what's happening in this exact moment with the current situation, in my opinion, is the superintendent is setting all the things and the board is window dressing. HISD's board for at least a decade, in my opinion, has been window dressing. Some of it, including your former opponent, curious window dressing, but window dressing because you're not setting the vision. So when T.E.A. leaves at whatever point that is, why will it be any different? Why will it be a situation that when you're back in the chair making the decisions, you're not passing the buck to the superintendent and saying they're the ones who should be doing this? They're implementers.
Let's let her respond, Mike.
Vision setters.
Let's let her respond.
So I think one of the critical pieces that we have been missing as a district and that this new administration is implementing is accountability at every single level. So even though the board set the vision and we said, okay, we're going to hold the superintendent accountable, the superintendent is not holding others accountable, and especially to student outcomes. Like there has to be alignment, right? We set the vision at the top and all of the other goals and metrics should align up to those that vision and values, right? That lives in the goals and the constraints. So that has been a void that has existed. You know, we asked for that for years while I was sitting on the board. I know previous board members asked for it. So, and especially given that we've been a decentralized district, you know, and a lot of people want to say, well, that's the root cause, that's the problem. Well, you can't have decentralization without high levels of accountability. And so I think that is critical. That's going to be a really critical piece when TEA leaves, to continue that accountability at every single level. And most importantly, at the school level, that's the principals, the school leaders, and really those above them as well need to have accountability for what we exist as a school district, right? So it should be, how are the students learning? How are they doing?
Let me ask Matt. Matt, can I ask a quick follow-up?
Of course, please jump in.
Generally quiet. What outcome do you, what is the outcome that you as a sitting trustee want to see for students?
If you
I'm not
were
talking
king
about third,
or queen.
I'm not talking third grade reading. I'm talking ultimate outcomes. So
The
let's pay
ultimate
6 years after
outcome,
high school.
yes, the ultimate outcome should be that students have a livable wage, that they have either a college degree, some sort of certificate that provides for them and their family in a way that they are healthy and happy, and that they have reached their potential or have the ability to reach their potential, that they shouldn't have barriers upon graduating, that they have to take remedial classes, or they can't get into college because of their scores, or they can't take a certificate because it's not offered. We should have a large variety of opportunities for students prior to them graduating, so that when they leave the doors of our high school, when they graduate, that they are set up for success. And currently, that is not the case. So currently in Harris County, 22% of students earn some sort of credential within 6 years of their high school graduation, 22%.
Only.
And yet,
let's make sure we say only.
Yes, that's like barely over 1 in 5.
Wow.
And the crazy thing is, when I was campaigning, it was 20%. So it was like two percentage points more in the last 4 years. And yet the CCMR accountability, right? How schools and districts are rated for college and career readiness by the state, the scores are much higher because students are checking a box of criteria saying, yes, I took an AP class, or yes, I took dual credit. But there's no guarantee that the student is on the path for success. So a much better metrics are, did they earn an associate's degree? Did they earn an industry-based certification that actually has, you know, there is a demand for that, not just, well, here's a certificate and good luck getting a job, but there's actually, like, nursing has a shortage, right? And we know that electricians are in high demand, like all these things that students could be doing. So I am very passionate. I could talk for a long time about this. There's actually outcomes bonus funding that the state has that districts are not maximizing, that would, like, if they would make those investments, it would pay for itself in the long run of giving these students the opportunities that they deserve so that they can be on a much better path. So yes, third grade reading is an early indicator, but we should be looking at pre-K, right? All of those indicators early on, and making sure that students are at every single level, getting every single opportunity, so that when they leave, they are set up for success.
Sorry.
I'm curious. Okay, so my, I guess, frustration comes from you all, and I'm using you as an example because you're on the spot right now, but all of you have this opportunity to make this huge difference. I mean, you have this certain amount of power, a lot of power actually. And, you know, I listen, and sometimes it kind of sounds like womp, 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 womp. When I listen to all the different, you know, trustees and everybody, they know they know how to talk the talk. And what I'm wondering is, when you all get into your sessions and when you all meet, when do you exert that power? Like what you just said was powerful. That lets me know you know what you're talking about. You know what we need. And I'm thinking about me in that same seat. Like I would be climbing on tables if they couldn't hear me. Like, I mean, we would, you know, walking away, making sure everybody is fighting that same fight. It's so very important. And it felt like all of you were in silos. Everybody individually was very articulate and knew what the problems were and knew how to address, you know, they could talk about it. But when you got together, it's like, where was the back down? Where was the backbone? Like who, you know, when you say accountability, like if I had the power to be sitting in that seat, like they would have to shut me up and carry me out of there. When I got third graders, you know, because when you say Black boys, that's a lot of boys.
A lot.
Because that constitutes Latino boys. I mean, we're talking about children of color. So, and now it's, you know, and those are the boys that are committing the crimes, that are robbing and stealing in the neighborhoods that these board members sit in. And that they don't rob in my neighborhood where we live, because nothing over here. They come, you would think that you would want to improve their outcomes, because it would make it safer for you to walk to your car at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're coming home from your daughter's wedding or whatever. You know, I mean, you see all these things that happen, and when they show the crime and they show the criminal, it always funnels back down to your Jack Yates High School, your, you know, Jesse Jones High School, you know, these schools that are putting out these kids that don't have what you just said you want kids to see. So I'm like, well, in the inner circle, when you're in those meetings, like, I'm trying to get a really good picture so I won't feel so angry at all of them about what happens in those meetings, and how do we lose every time. I mean, every time the vote was made, when I say we, the schools that I represent, and I know I'm biased because I'm you know, this has been my life work, but I would say, you know, the vote never went in to a point where I stopped watching, because I knew that, you know, what we had to do on the ground. We had to go open up our own charter schools. Charter schools wouldn't even be in existence if the board and the superintendent had been doing what they were supposed to do in HISD. So Matt and I had to kind of go over to the charter side just to make a difference in the community we live in, because we just wanted to see outcomes better for kids, and we knew we couldn't control what was happening. So I'm just wondering, like, I know I'm asking a lot. These guys they straighten me up. They know how to fix what I'm saying, but I get so angry, because I feel like when you had the seat, when you were in that position, as smart and as much influence as you had, why did you fight?
So I would say I did fight. And I think your question is so important and so valid.
The fight didn't come to us. Like, you didn't bring the fight back to the people, because if you'd have brought fight back, we would have came and fought with you. So from where we stand, it looked like you weren't fighting at all. That's a good point.
Yeah, no, and I think your question is valid, because I think there's several different ways to fight, right? I mean, I think, you know, screaming and like, you know, yelling, and like that's the what we view as fighting. I tend to dig my heels in, and I'm very stubborn, and what I believe in, I will stand up for, and I do it very quietly to the point where people get kind of upset with me, because they're just like, oh, she's not budging. But man, like, we're trying. And so it's interesting, because I came into this position very naively, right? Thinking I'm going to make a difference, right? You don't run for this unless you are somewhat crazy and you want to make a difference, right? Because you're doing this for free. You know, there's a whole million of reasons why you shouldn't do it. A lot of work, but you, like, fundamentally, I was like, I can make a difference, right? I have this skill set. I have these abilities. I can be better than the person before me. And I very quickly realized, you know, we're a body of 9, really 10. It's a team of 10, right? The 9 trustees and the superintendent working towards a common vision and a common goal. And I was like, we're going to get this done, right? We all care about kids. And it was amazing. I remember my first few months, I kept sending people the little GIF of the hamster in the wheel, because I was just like, I am spending so much time and energy. And I'm like, what is, nothing's happening, right? This is insane. Like, what am I doing? I just feel like I'm spinning my wheels. And I will say that's probably most of my tenure on the board. I did feel like that. It's really difficult to get anything done without a majority. And I really tried, I think, to build bridges, build relationships. You know, I showed up with my weaknesses and my failures, and with my biases, and that definitely made it difficult, not just for me, but for my colleagues, you know. And so that, I think, is also, it not only is it complicated, but that gets in the way of what the work really is, right? We come with our biases, we come with our personal beliefs. We hear rumors, we think, oh, this person said this about me. I mean, like, a whole level of pettiness, I'm going to be very honest, exists, and will probably exist, not just, you know, just any group of people that you bring together. And especially, like, we didn't choose each other, right? We chose to run for this seat, and then, you know, we're all in this together. but the pettiness was, that kind of things like really get in the way of keeping that focus on students. And yes, I absolutely should have done a better job of communicating with the community, of saying, hey, these are the things that are happening. This is what really matters. Like, y'all need to show up, come speak. And that takes a whole level of like time and energy that I wish that I had had more of. And I recognize that it's needed. And so you raise a really important point, because one trustee or even 9 trustees, like, we are the voice of the community. We're guardians of the public trust. Like, we really do need to have ability to be able to share these priorities with the community, help the community be able to understand what decisions are being made at the board level, and why, what's important and what matters, and how it affects parents and their students, but really how it affects everyone, right? The future of our city belongs to all of us. So thank you for that question.
So Tori, let me see if I can add, and then you also, I hope you're ready to ask a question. What I'm hearing is distraction. Like Judith mentioned that at the very beginning, that there's just constant distraction at the board level, in the news. Everything that doesn't matter gets elevated. Tori, I think you brought up an excellent point, which is most people have no idea what we know about the youth outcomes. Like the data that Judith just shared, 22% of kids have this, what we would all probably consider to be a reasonable outcome of having some credential allows them to get a job, having an income, having something 6 years after high school where they are safe and they're okay. 22%. And that's the number that we don't ever talk about either. So, and then the third, I think, Judith, I'm hearing you saying over and over again that in those halls, those conversations, the pettiness, the distraction is happening there too. And so that causes me to want to really pick up on Tori's idea of, we just need to just tell the community. We got to get the community involved in this fight, because whomever is sitting on that board, if they're being petty, then they're pissing on kids. And we can't, as a community, we can't allow that. So Tori's idea of sharing this out with the community and saying, this is what's actually happened to your kids, get pissed, and then fight the right way, get angry about the right things, fight the right way. That means making sure that the elected officials, or in this case, appointed officials, know that we're pissed. We're angry that this data is not changing, and we got to get some change. So that to me is kind of a summary of what I heard so far. So let me shut up and let me move it on to Uyosa.
Yeah, I'm sitting here and I've been quiet because I'm ingesting everything. For me, I always kind of know on these in these conversations that I come from a very different kind of paradigm of thought when it comes to schooling and what the work looks like, right? Because I do agree, especially on this last note, about the need for trustees to not act as kind of district emperors that don't necessarily, engage with folks. But I also think in general, it is very difficult for volunteer folks who also have their own work. I do think, just like our Houston City Council charter needs to be changed in many ways to make decision-making much more equitable, I think the way we even structure decision-making at the school board level needs to be reimagined totally. So I think there's definitely conversation to be had there at some point. But I think my focus on is, what is that work really? I think right before this conversation, we were talking about the world is literally boiling, right? And we're in it. And I do see the need to have a conversation about jobs and certifications and the skills that can meet the ability to get to those jobs. But in my professional, I'm an organizer, right? So my work is around getting people together to actually care about and learn how to work towards the most difficult issues of our time. And I don't see any sort of level of thinking about empathy, thinking about, and the resources that are necessary to get there, right? Empathy, or even skills around collective decision making and self-governance. So I don't see that happening, and I don't see that as a part of the conversation in these kind of so-called, outcomes that we have discussions about often. So I'm curious, and I guess the question with all that context is, are we kind of window dressing this idea that we're doing the work that's actually necessary for the time that we're in? Or is there a need to step back and have a bigger conversation on maybe we don't have to have the expectation that every student has to strive for some of the best jobs. Maybe they need to actually learn how to unionize as well. I'm wondering what can we do to kind of progress those conversations is there a need to do that from your perspective?
Absolutely. I think it's an and, not an or. And, when I talk about students being ready and prepared for post-secondary, it's like they have the ability to choose their path, right? That they're not constrained to one path because that was the only path given to them, and that was the only path that they were prepared for, and that they have the ability to do, right? They should have everything at their disposal, whether they want to start in business and be an entrepreneur, whether they want to be an organizer and help community stand up for issues, right? It could be a number of things, but they have to be able to have those options. They have to know, one, what's possible, and two, have all of the tools that they need and have been given so that they can make those choices. So I think it's really critical. And you brought up other skill sets, right, that are more like, we tend to call them soft skills, but I think they are so critical to our students, to their well-being, to their success, their long-term success. And I think we are, we're not just losing that in schools, but I feel like just kind of as a society, that's something we need to focus on. And I think it's something, when we talk about student outcomes, we say it's what students know and are able to do. I would argue that that's part of that as well. So I think, thinking about whether we're measuring that or not, but if we're putting resources into schools for that, I mean, there's a much larger push for social emotional learning. And I don't think it should be like a silo. I think it should just be all embedded into the academics. And there are some programs that are doing that pretty well, more than others. But I think it's really critical to develop the whole child, where they're thinking critically, but they're also empathy is so important. So thank you for raising that.
Uyosa, back to you.
If we wanted to make trustees' lives much easier going forward, we need a population of folks who are not only able to engage from the infrastructure standpoint of changing around the infrastructure of decision-making, but also are used to making decisions on behalf of their lives. So I guess what my conclusion based off of what you're saying would naturally be like, oh, we need to lower the voting age to 16, right? Because they need to get in the habit, right, of making decisions that are going to impact them. So I'm wondering, do you advocate for that? Do you think that that's the direction that we should be having conversations about, considering that other municipalities across the country have already done that?
So let me make sure I understand your question. I mean, besides the voting age, because you're basically saying in order for anyone to ever be prepared for office, they should be practicing those decision making early on. Is that
I think if anyone wants to be prepared to vote, period, they should be making decisions early, because that's voting is a decision. And we know that's what the research shows, right? The earlier that kids can exercise agency and autonomy in their life and self-governance, it makes them more likely to participate and vote later on in life. So I'm wondering, like, is that a direction that we should be going into, considering that, I want to make trustees' lives much easier, right? Because I think I just can't have, district emperors, if I just to use that.
I like that title. No, it's a really good question. Something that I am not familiar with and haven't done research based on what you're telling me. That sounds logical. I mean, I think about kids are able to drive when they're 16, right? They make a lot of decisions. I would just like to look at that a little more before I could definitively say, yes, that makes sense. In terms of just the overall issue that you're raising in making trustees' lives easier, like, okay, if we lower the voting age, that would be more people voting for trustees. That number is so low. I think it's like 10%. if that, in Harris County vote for school board elections. And so a lot of people are like, we want our democratically elected board. I'm like, y'all, we barely voted for them, right? Like, I'm
Right.
including myself
Yeah.
in that. We need to really build a lot more education and awareness around civic engagement in general. And it sounds like you're very familiar with that, but really school board elections, most people don't pay attention to those. I
Yeah.
personally knocked on 3,500 doors.
Mhm.
Y'all, this is in 2019 when HISD was in the news every day. And I only knocked on high propensity voters, so people that would vote in every single election, no matter what, even if there was a hurricane. And they couldn't even tell it. Like, most of them were like, oh, something's happening at HISD. So
Yeah.
most people just aren't paying attention, right? So that's a really critical piece that you bring up.
Yeah, and I also think campaigns would fundamentally change, right? Because if you have about I don't know how many kids are in Bel Air, so please forgive me, y'all, whoever's listening. If you have 2,500 voters who are sitting in Bel Air, then you have no choice but to go talk to those students, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking about how, there's a lot of people who complain that they never even see their trustee ever. Well, then people who are serious, who want to get into that position, have no choice but to go to the school and actually coddle to kids, right? That's a really weird thing for people to think about, but it would actually have to pitch and sell, right, what they're really interested in doing in public office, no matter what school. So that's why I want to make trustees' lives even much more substantial.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it would just have, they can talk to students. It just can't be on school property, unfortunately. It's
let's change that up too. I mean, look,
right?
I don't, what I'm saying? We'll have conversations, right?
So if I could pick up on this, Yosi, you're bringing up a really interesting point. I think asking the question, how do we make trustees' lives easier, is actually an interesting reframe. Because as you were talking, Judith, it just seems like it's just I almost cursed on this show. This is a family show, y'all.
I was right there with you, Matt.
Yeah, it almost looks like it's an unwinnable governance structure. And so if that's the situation, how do we make it more likely to win? I think some of those ideas are what Uios is getting at. Like, if youth were allowed to vote.
But it's not unwinnable. It's the people we've elected make it unwinnable. I've been on a board. It's unwinnable because you've got the personalities of teacher union supported folks who are beholden to a group of people who don't want what's best for kids. They want what's best for teachers. And I recognize what I just said is probably not going to put me in good stead, but I'm already not there. So you've got personality issues on the current board because of who the community and the 10% or less have elected. This is not whether school boards can function is a different question. I'm all for what you said about making lives easier. I think we've got the wrong team on the team right now on the bus, and so I don't think the current appointed is much better. But go ahead, Matt. I'm sorry.
No, Mike, I think you're right. I think this is the conversation that we really need to have. Like, let's be honest. Why TEA? Why is TEA here? Because we elected nut jobs. We elected a bunch of nut jobs, and they were all fighting over each other. And whenever adults fight,
not you, Judith.
Not you. This is back in 2017, 18, right? 16, 17, 18, like nut jobs. And those nut jobs invited TEA to come because TEA is sitting in Austin saying, this place is a shit show. And I'm going to go ahead and put it out there. Sorry for any young listeners. So as a result of that, we have all this drama. And right now, before TEA stepped in, I would argue that we had elected folk who were fighting at cross purposes. I can't tell you how many times I sat at a board meeting and didn't hear a single conversation about youth outcomes. Not a single one. It was all about contracts and vendors and all these other things that have nothing to do with the youth outcome. So, Mike, yes, union power is one of the pieces that corrupts this, but also vendor power, but also real estate interests. I mean, there's a whole bunch of frames here that causes that board to become a circular firing squad.
I think the only thing that can make a change is the people. I mean, if the people, if we knew what was going on, like you all were saying, if we knew, when I say we, I mean people, just teacher, even teachers, I would say, want what's best for students. I don't think that they don't want what's best for students. They're on the front line every day. So they want what's best for students. But I think that we don't realize, sometimes people don't realize the power that we have. But I don't remember past Jolanda Jones trying to go out to the people and rally them up. And I'm not, I'm not for anybody. There's a right way to do everything. I agree with you, Judith. Like, there's a right way. Fighting is not always in the way you fight. But still, I still think that there were a lot of things that we just didn't know as just community people, parents, grandparents. We just didn't know. And from the outside looking in, I've already said what that looked like. But I think that to what you all are saying, if we really want to change, if we want to see the change, somebody's got to put some fire under the behinds of these people that are sitting in these seats. Because Mike is absolutely right. They were
So, hey, so let me pick that up and ask. So, Judith, you talked about, yeah, nice. You talked about Lone Star governance. The three of the four of us on this call went through the opportunity, and I'll put that in quotes because I think it was not much of one, to be considered to be boards of managers, and did the Lone Star governance. And I've well familiar with it from when AJ first started talking about it 7 years ago or whatever it was. So a huge component of Lone Star governance is community engagement, right? You agree with that? Right. It is definitely not happening right now, right? No. But what Tori is saying is it wasn't happening before either.
No, it
wasn't. And I live in HISD. I live in a different district than you, as you know. The district I live in was part of the reason that T.E.A. came in. It's District 1. I'm wondering, as far as I know, that person had a couple of community meetings, but they weren't advertised. I don't know what you were doing because I'm not in your district, and the fact that that's the case is a different question. But what do you see as the way? I mean, Tori's right, Matt's right, UES is right. This is a community engagement issue. If you got less than 10% of the people voting and now everybody's mad, so why will it be different? And I don't mean just community engagement, by the way, to frame it, is not, we're going to tell you what we already did. Hope you like it. Community engagement is, what do you as a community want for your children by way of outcomes, and how do we as a team work to accomplish that objective? That's community engagement. And that isn't happening. That hadn't happened in my experience.
Agree.
What's the difference? What would you say?
And that is actually, I mean, that is a pretty big tenet of the Lone Star governance framework, right? Is listening for those vision and values, and not just like a one-time thing, like, right, we had a meeting or a series of meetings and come to our meeting, right? It's like you are embedded in the community, you're going to the meetings that already exist, the organizations and clubs, the civic associations, listening for those vision and values and helping folks understand how the board gets the school district to those outcomes for our students, right? So it's a two-way conversation, right? It's not just I'm here to listen or I'm here to tell you, right? It's creating that trust and building those dialogues around what it is that we want for our students, right? The best possible outcomes for them. So that is a really critical piece. Kind of addressing a little bit more about what y'all brought up, because thinking about, yes, like, why hasn't anything changed? Can something change, right? Why aren't people going out to the community? And honestly, I wouldn't even say half as much community engagement as I would have liked to. You know, it's hard as a volunteer position. I mean, I'm just going to be honest. I hate to use as an excuse. And I think it's something that we need to think about long-term, right? Like, to you else's point, how do we reimagine this? How do we build in structures that can help trustees have better community engagement? Maybe it's a team of volunteers, or, I mean, I don't know what it could look like, right? But I think we can definitely think about what that could look like in the long term. But even with that, you know, just thinking about the pipeline of who's running for these seats, right? So we're thinking about the greater community and the community being informed and making better choices at the ballot box, and just holding folks accountable, holding their feet to the fire, right, for these outcomes. You said you were going to accomplish this, right? These are the goals that you set. Where are our kids? Asking those tough questions and making sure that that we're making choices at the ballot box based on that. But I think just as importantly, preparing folks to run for these positions. And most people in their right minds don't want to do this, right? It is a volunteer position. You're going to get yelled and hated at no matter what you do. You can't please everybody. It's tough. It's not for the faint of heart. You have to have very thick skin. But there are plenty of people that with the right supports can do it. And I think it's, there's a lot of money in the city, a lot of money that support different special interests. But I truly believe that, the power belongs to the people, right? And if we are helping educate, if we're helping support, and then we can find the funds, right? The right funds to support candidates. But I think it's really critical to identify people that are willing to do this and have the right heart and mind. And I really do believe that nobody does this like with all the special interests in their heart, right? Everybody wants what's best for kids, but it's so easy once being in that position to get pulled in a million different directions. And to, even if you think in your heart you're making the best decisions for kids, adult interests are there and they are just so prevalent.
Yeah. Who's got Tori?
Yeah.
Or
I was
Okay.
gonna. So I'll tell a little story. I don't know if I've told this story to my fellow co-host outside of this meeting, but earlier we just got out of a session, and earlier this year, I was tasked, amongst many different things, I was tasked at my work to interface with students at an HISD high school, won't name just so I can, keep them out of everything. But these are one of the high schools, basically, to Matt's point, where we're talking about low literacy rates in regards to Black boys and all these other different issues, right? So this was at the very beginning of my engagement with them, and I was doing different monthly kind of workshops. The second workshop is when I went over the process of session, and I was explaining that, hey, in these certain months, March, April, and the beginning of May are the most important for the public to get involved, right? I say that, and then I keep going in, and I finish off, and I say, hey, are there any questions? There's a Black boy who's in the corner. He raises his hand, all sheepishly, and he says, earlier, a couple slides ago, you were talking about, this is the time for the public to get involved. When you say public, does that mean us? And all of a sudden, in the back of my mind, I'm like screaming. And in the front of my mind, I'm obviously like stone-faced. But this stuff starts very early, right? There is no way that anyone who's even currently alive, including myself, is going to create a system that is pure and will never have any issues whatsoever. So what do we do to create the infrastructure where people are engaged and have the ability to make decisions early, right? So that's where I feel like sometimes in some of these conversations, not here, but just generally in schooling, then I'm outside the paradigm entirely with what the conversation's about. Because honestly, when we're talking about the history of the farm workers and what they did back in the day and the huge organizing they did, yes, I'm not going to say literacy wasn't important, but literacy wasn't important for them, right? And they changed the world, right? There are organizing skills and facilitation skills that we are all now doing. The word house meeting, right? That these are things that are because of some very illiterate but very powerful and collective power people did, right? And that's because there was all sorts of shared learning or not. So I understand it's a yes and, but I also don't get as much seriousness or kind of focus on my end, right? So that's why I'm like, we really need to take every single kid seriously. This voting thing isn't some bourgeois, right, idea. It's actually very good for very low income minoritized folks to be involved in this way. So I just commentary, right, that I want to throw into the mix, not necessarily a question attached, but that's why I think this is so very serious, especially as literally the world is boiling. And, Exxon can't outlive the world boiling. So yes, we can get kids jobs there, but once the world's over, what are we doing?
Right.
Wow.
That's great.
Tori, did you have a comment or a question?
He always takes me to a whole nother place. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna save that in another space. But I think it's what he said was awesome. I don't know. I just think back to what you were saying about the power of the people. If I believe that there are people out here, like this whole game that everybody's playing about, this library game. I believe all that was intentional. It was, I call it a weapon of mass distraction. It just distracted people, layman people like me, who don't really know what's going on, to jump on a bandwagon about something. I mean, that's what it was, so that he can go do the stuff that he's doing. And actually, I'm not against everything he's doing. I'm just thinking that's what it was. But if something like that could spark so many people's interest, in my mind, as a politician, I would be playing that same game. Yeah. So the things that 10% of people that voted for you, Judith, and said, we're voting for you because you said you were going to do this, this, this. When you got in there and couldn't do those things, and you came back to that same 10% and said, hey, I'm trying to do what I told you I was going to do, but they're not budging, especially with this one thing, and make sure it's the one thing that's going to stick me in my side that I'm ready to fight for with you, then you've got a bunch of people behind you. And I think that it's called something, but to play the game with the people, there's certain things that really strike people, layman people like me, like I said, who don't read the news and listen to news all day, every day. As a teacher, I was a teacher all day, every day. Like, I mean, I just, if it didn't have anything to do with my kids, I wasn't even thinking about it. And so a lot of people are like me, and they wait until this buzz comes out about something. So like, now that this buzz is out about this library thing, and I'm not trivializing librarians, some of the best reading teachers on the planet, and I think that they are overlooked and all the things. But this problem is so much bigger than that. But everybody's laser focused on this library thing, and that's intentional, I believe, by the people who planted it. Anybody who knows anything about this community, after what Yolanda Jones did in getting libraries in all these schools, would know that as soon as he said no libraries, would know those same people were going to go fight to keep what in place. So that was intentional. It kept stuff going, gets us distracted off of what we should be looking at. I'm thinking that as a politician on a board where I'm not getting paid, a thankless job. It's a thankless job. It really is. You don't get paid. You got to work. You got to feed your own family. As much as I can get the people involved, let them do the work. I mean, just throw something out there at them that's going to make them. And I don't think it's always going to be super intellectual, because most people are not. And it may be a little messy, or some kind of, something that we might on this call may think is trivial, but it's not, just to get them ignited and started to fight behind you. Because I would have fought behind you.
Mike.
And so I don't
understand.
Use some of those tactics.
Yeah.
Thank you. Agree.
So the way we did it in Spring Branch was a very intentional use of what we term task forces. We didn't invent the wheel on this. This is a wheel that was invented decades ago, but we picked it up without even knowing we were doing it. And we used broadly representative task forces, included students, were in not all of them, but in some, included community members. It wasn't just the usual suspects. It was a broad community task forces. HISD is 7 times bigger than Spring Branch, actually 6 now. Whole separate conversation about losing 40,000 students in 6 years. You've lost a district the size of Spring Branch in 6 years. Separate conversation. The intentional use of task forces, broadly representative, gives you the ability to then look to those people with whom you've worked consciously to develop the vision as your working army. What Tori is saying. So if you got a room full of 80 people, and at the end of a 6-week process or 6-month process, or in some cases, we took 2 years. We took 2 years to redo our class rank policy. After that, when that's done, and those people have met for a couple of years together, you don't need to tell them what to go do. They're your frontline fighters. When you go out to do a bond, if you got a task force of 200 people, you don't have to work very hard. They do the work. They're your front line.
Basic organizing, right?
And so that's why I kept waiting for District 1, which has some problem schools. Like, we got some schools that are identified problems, to come to the community and say, hey, what do you want? And crickets. Like, I invited that conversation. I don't know what it's going to take for that to be the case. I mean, we're all saying the same thing. The community will find a voice. It's just going to be distractible. That's Tori's point. I mean, you're going to be talking about libraries or masks or, problem du jour, rather than, Judith, what you
Recess.
articulately said earlier around recess. What you said earlier, which is my whole focus, was 6-year outcomes post high school being some measurable thing. And you said that you agreed with that without even knowing that was my position. So,
Right.
I mean, we're not focused on that. We don't have any idea of what that looks like, because as a community, we're going to focus on, whatever's the next thing coming down the pipe for about 2 days or 2 weeks, and then there will be another thing. So the next thing is real predictable right now. Real predictable. I can tell you what's coming next, but it'll be something sideways, like, so
Jim,
I just wonder why what would it take for the district to do what Lone Star Governance actually suggests, which is the kind of community-based task forces as an intentional rather than a one-off?
I think we demand it as a community, right? We don't wait for the district. We don't wait for a board to organize that. We put it into place and we say, this is what we expect, because at the end of the day, the vision and values live with the community. Whether the leadership of the board changes, whether the superintendent changes, and there will be many iterations, right? The vision and values, like what we believe is possible for our kids. And, our kids are going to grow up in these communities, right? Our grandkids, and we stay in on the leadership changes and goes. So that to me is a really critical piece. We can't wait, right? It's up to us to do it. And, I can use the excuse of my time as a trustee. I didn't have the time, whatever. Well, now's the time for me or for the rest of us to do that. And I think back to one of the comments you made, Tori, and it's interesting because it does take a level of political savviness to be in this position, which is tough. It doesn't come to me naturally. It's definitely something that I've been learning. I remember my first year on the board, one of my colleagues told me, some of us are playing chess and some of us are playing checkers, implying that I was playing checkers. I was like,
some people are playing
right? I'm trying to figure this. How is everybody else playing the game? I mean, it is so true. Like, it is a game of chess. You have to figure out who's making the next move and when, and you've got to outsmart them. And doesn't mean that you're going to play the game. You're just making sure you know what the next move is so that you can be prepared for it. But it is a level of political savviness that doesn't come naturally. It's learned, I think.
Definitely learn. Definitely anything that kids should learn. Okay. I'm happy I was on mute because I screamed. Yeah, tic-tac-toe as well, right? I have a quick question that may not be a quick one, but I feel like it may be easier. Speaking of accountability, I don't know, and let me know if it's possible. Is it possible for community members to try to put a referendum to oust the board member early, right? And the reason why I ask, Mike is the reason why I ask, and maybe this will be my next question, is
there's no recall.
None. The reason why I asked that time after the I believe the gun or shooting or whatever happened at Bel Air, where Lathan wanted to put metal detectors, or was looking into putting metal detectors in several campuses, and I saw what the vote came down to. I was like, we just saw the most against best practice vote. Thank God it didn't pass, but I'm at that moment I was wondering, okay, then what do we do with this? Because if there's no communication meetings, there's no sort of conversation, and then voters can't throw people out early, what do we do?
Right.
But yeah, I guess there might just answer the question. If someone could give more context for folks who are listening as well in those scenarios.
Yeah, it's basically state law, right? There's state law there is no recourse. Like, right, even as board members, if we wanted to take some kind of action against another board member, we can't even censor them. There's literally, the only thing is the ballot box every 4 years.
Judith, I don't know. I'm really, Leo, so you've messed me up here. I'm really thinking a lot about whether or not the board can function. And Mike, you think it can? I think it can only with a very informed and very focused electorate. And to get that requires a lot of time, a lot organizing, a lot of resources. And who would pay for that resource? I don't see anybody who's incented for kids to have good outcomes. I mean, parents are that's my focus, because parents are the most incentive for a positive outcome. But parents aren't organized. Parents aren't active, and youth are the second most, and maybe even the most incentive for a positive outcome. They don't have any organization. They're not supported in any way. Who does? All the folks that make money from the district. So I'm not so sure if how this works if we don't fundamentally change how the structure of the board occurs.
So we're watching that happen, Matt, right now. You're watching the alternative right this second, in my opinion.
How do you mean?
You're watching autocrat. And I don't know whether Mike Miles' stuff is going to work or not. I don't think it will, because I think he's focused on autocratic, fear-based, forced short-term resolution rather than long-term outcomes. But who knows? I mean, if it works, it'll be a new paradigm, and we'll see. I don't think it will. But you're seeing what it looks like to have one person running the show. There's no board policy being drafted. What did the board just unilaterally, with no discussion, approved all the policy changes? The board didn't propose those policy changes, and that's the board's job. Those were all policy changes that were proposed by either T.E.A. or Miles. So you're seeing what it looks like as an alternative without an elected school board right now. And I don't think that this is better. And I'm going to come back to what you said. I don't know that school boards work. I know the one board I served on in my life worked. We did a heck of a lot of work, and I think, modestly, we moved a lot of water. And the outcomes that we got, I mean, we moved the needle from Judith's 22% countywide. We were at 36. We moved it to 44 in 5 years, which is a big jump, but they've backslid too. I don't know. I don't know if it works. I know that what it looks like right now is challenging.
But it won't work. I think we can agree it will not work unless there's a broad community that is as focused on the outcomes that matter as we hope to be in these conversations. And without that, every superintendent that comes in has the opportunity to manipulate the board members. Every new board member that comes in has the opportunity to either enrich themselves, as has been happening, or position themselves for the next elected office, not thinking about kids. Like, we've got a community problem. It's not a board, it's a community problem.
Judith, do you have any thought about?
I absolutely, I have hope. Like, I really do, and I was torn when I ran in 2019. I was like, do I believe in a democratically elected board? Like, y'all, it can work. And there is so much research around, like, when school boards are focused on the right thing, like, it makes us, like, data, right? You can see the numbers, like, kids actually learn and do better. It will take a lot of effort, right? We can't, this is not, like you said, it's not just the board. It takes a community effort to elect the right people, to have a pipeline, continuous pipeline, right? That is ready to run every 4 years. So really every 2 years, the way HISD is.
But the people can't wake up because the state comes in. They need to stay woke.
Right.
So, I mean, they didn't wake up and try to make a change until the state came in. So that's why I can't be an advocate against them coming in, because if that's what it took to get people to wake up, and I'm talking about the people in the schools that were suffering. They weren't. Right. They needed to wait, and now that they're waking up, it's like, how do we keep them woke? And so I do agree.
Do you think
it can change? I mean, I think that it can be done. I think the board.
Do you one of the challenges that I've heard from not just you, Judith, but from others who have sat in the chair is you got 9 single member districts in HISD. That is a meaningful difference between HISD and Spring Branch. We were 7 at large, and we could talk for a long time about whether that's a better system and whether that's democratic. And it doesn't take looking at that dais to know that perhaps it's not. And it's no question that HISD with 9 single member districts creates a dynamic that isn't necessarily focused on the best outcomes for all 9 districts.
That's
So
right.
the long predicate to this question, which is, how would you feel about some, maybe 4 of the 9 being at large, maybe 2, some number of at large?
Yeah, I mean, I think before even going down that path, I think more importantly is just educating the electorate, right? Because you can have at large single member, it's still going to be the same special interest, right? It's not like that doesn't really change. And yes, having single member districts does create a dynamic and attention many times. And really, when you're running, you have to go into that mindset that you're representing all kids in the district, right? Whether or not you're elected by a single member district. But I think there's pros and cons to both scenarios, but I don't think it takes the special interests out. I think it takes out the turf wars, but there's the special interests. I think really the community saying we want something different has to come first.
Yeah, for me, it's an equity question, and it looks to me like the resource allocation. I mean, just look at the buildings. Resource allocation in HISD has historically been inequitably done. My mother was a teacher at Grissom in the late 70s, and it wasn't equitable then, and it's less equitable now. And that's a part and parcel with the idea that perhaps if you had somebody who was looking out for everybody on a policy side, not on a superintendent side, but it's just a thought.
So let me ask another question. Another one of those hot button issues is, and this is probably going to come under T.E.A.'s leadership, so would love to get your thoughts on this. Part of the issue with the inequity is because we've got too many schools. And they're in the wrong places. Let's say both. And so at some point, either we have a different model. Like I remember I was on a committee with HISD, and we were talking about having the same types of resources, school nurse, librarian, et cetera, at every school. It's not reasonable because some schools are huge and you need multiple ones there. And some schools are really small. You can't afford to have them there. There's a resource limitation here that comes from having so many schools that have very, very low attendance. What are your thoughts about school closure, consolidation, creating more economies of scale, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, it's inevitable, right? And I remember I got interviewed by a lot of reporters when T.E.A. first made their announcement and said, oh, it's going to come with school closures. And I was like, let me be clear, whether it's an elected or a appointed board, school closures and consolidations are inevitable because we have a major structural deficit that is going to come calling to us by 2025. We're riding on our federal stimulus money right now. And we have the same amount of students that we had in 1988, and we have 50 more buildings. And we have a lot more employees than we did when we did prior to that too. And so we definitely need to look at prioritizing. And like you said, and we have a weighted student funding formula, which should be equitable. The problem is we pile on all of these we have magnet funding and we have small school subsidies and all of these other one-time money. And that's where all the inequities come in, right? And because we have so many districts, so many schools that are smaller or under-enrolled, then we're giving them money so they can stay alive, right? But then that's taking money from other students. So they
stay alive. They don't have enough money.
And it's not equity anymore, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I think we just need to reimagine, we have some really unique campuses in our district. You think about Energy Institute, project-based learning. It's pretty unique. We have some Montessori, but I think we always want to think that we have to do school a certain way and that we have to have everything be the same. And we talk about differentiating in classrooms, but we're not really innovating and reimagining. Somebody asked me about if I thought Miles was innovative. I'm like, that is definitely not how I would describe him. I think he is much more about an adherence to a very clear structure. Will that work out? I don't like
Dictator.
to be seen, right? Like, we want to see how that's going to work. But innovation in terms of like thinking about how we do school and how we provide school for kids is like really where we need to be thinking.
But
We're
Judith,
stuck in a very 100 years ago structure.
right. But Judith, it goes back to this community engagement thing, because I've seen so many politicians play on this school closure thing to rally troops and to fight against closure, not having a conversation that none of the students in that school are reading on grade level, right? So they're fighting for a school that's not serving kids. And I've seen it happen over and over again in my district and others. So if there is a school closure conversation, that's going to whip up anger, whip up opposition to anything that happens in HISD. And the conversation that needs to be had around, we've got huge inequities. We've got 50 more schools. This is a stat that I didn't know. We've got 50 more schools than we had in 2019. What did you say?
88.
1988. Same number of students, 50 more schools, a lot more employees. We cannot afford this. And if we want our schools to be well supported with libraries, et cetera, we can't have them all spread out, right? That's a conversation that I think most people understand. But once Miles comes out with a school closure conversation, there's going to be no opportunity to have a rational conversation about that.
Agree.
But Matt, we shouldn't be just having this as a one-off. That's, I guess, coming back kind of full circle to where I will always come back to. So a one-off conversation about school closures is a fill-in-the-blank conversation. It could be a one-off about recess, or a one-off about libraries, or a one-off about masks, or a one-off about whatever. It's a one-off. It doesn't go, is closing the schools. This was my conversation was in Spring Branch was, at the end of the day, if football supports the ultimate objective of 6-year after high school student outcome, we have football. And if it doesn't, we don't have football. To pick the most aggressive thing that I could find that would be the noise, you don't get rid of football, it's Texas, right? But the one-off deal of, we're going to do the one-off without giving the people, like Tori, you were saying, without giving the people the opportunity to say, what we really want for our students is this, gives puts the frame around it of such a narrow focus that you're talking about closing a neighborhood school without any options for the people. And you're right, Matt. What's going to happen is Miles is going to say, here's the plan for school closure. And it's going to be a fully fleshed out, I alluded to this earlier. I wasn't going to speak directly to it, but it is a fully fleshed out, fully developed plan that's going to be presented as a done deal. And then people are just going to scream at him, and it's going to happen anyway, without any community engagement, and a total bust of Lone Star governance. And so what the purpose of the podcast is, when TEA leaves, it's going to be a picking up the pieces if this community doesn't get real active right now and start having their voices heard about what we want. Because otherwise, this is going to be a whatever it's going to look like in a few years, and then we're going to go back to electing whatever the opposite of that is, just to not have that. Right. And it'll just be a circle.
We'll be back to
and
square one.
Okay, that wasn't a question. That was more of a comment.
Well, I think you're signaling what I'm feeling, what Tori's feeling. I'm sure Uyosa, Judith, maybe yourself as well. We've got to think deeper and longer term around this process of TEA. Otherwise, we're going to always be, whacking the mole, or to your point, Mike, having these one-off conversations. So I think I'm going to look at inviting some community organizers on this show to give some perspective, maybe what they might do, how they might do it, although maybe we know how it's done. It's just a question of who would do it. So anyway, Judith, any last comment?
I was just going to say thank you, because having the conversation, a public conversation, is step one, right? And increasing that reach, sharing our thoughts with more people is where it starts. Awareness building. That's
our hope. Well, listen, thanks, Judith. Thanks for stepping forward and running for office. I know how painful that was. Thanks for coming on the show and have the conversation. Really hope to include you in the process of getting the community ready for when TEA leaves. So with that, we'll conclude this call and this conversation. Thanks for being a part, and hopefully will join us the next time we have a conversation. This is TEA Leaves Houston, signing off.